So the ATF is now in big trouble and faces down a national injunction against their new rule on frames and receivers. So let's talk about this. But real quick before we jump into this video, if you agree that the ATF needs to be abolished, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. So like I said in the intro, the ATF is now trying to desperately prevent a federal court from expanding its injunction in a way that would bar the ATF nationally from enforcing their new rule on frames and receivers. The case we're going to be talking about in this video is Vanderstock v. Garland. The last update I had for you on this case was that a federal judge actually granted a limited preliminary injunction in favor of the plaintiff's tactical machining, and that was against the ATF and their enforcement of that new rule on frames and receivers. However, he also requested additional briefings on whether or not he should expand the scope of his injunction. Should he expand it to also protect the customers of the company, other manufacturers, and also whether or not he should actually grant a national injunction. Now, if you're not aware what this lawsuit entails and what this all deals with, this lawsuit deals with the ATF and their new rule on frames and receivers. This new rule by the ATF is essentially a restriction on the sale of 80% kits. Under the new rule, 80% kits are treated to actually be firearms. This new rule by the ATF went into the regulatory definition of what is defined to be a firearm. It changed a bunch of definitions around through a bunch of various references, just a giant web of references, and then it ultimately led to 80% kits being defined to actually be firearms under this statutory code. In this case, Vanderstock, the plaintiffs requested a preliminary injunction from the court to enjoin, i.e. halt the enforcement of the ATF's new rule on frames and receivers. On review, District Court Judge Reed O'Connor granted a limited preliminary injunction against the ATF. In reaching his decision, he stated, "That which may become a receiver is not itself a receiver. Congress could have included firearms parts that may be readily converted to frames or receivers, as it did with weapons that may readily be converted to fire a projectile, but it omitted that language when talking about frames and receivers." He also stated, ATF's new definition of frame or receiver is facially unlawful. The issue here, he states, is whether ATF may still regulate a component as a frame or receiver, even after ATF determines that the component in question is not a frame or receiver at the time of evaluation. He stated Congress has not extended ATF's authority so far. That the firearm part is designed to be, or may one day become, a frame or receiver does not change the fact that in the moment it is not the frame or receiver of any such weapon. So looking at the ATF's rule on frames and receivers, he found that it is facially invalid under the plain text of the statute and that Congress did not grant the ATF authority to regulate these types of items. So in his order, he granted a limited preliminary injunction in favor of one of the plaintiff's tactical machining. However, in the order, he also allowed the other plaintiffs in the case to file additional arguments to him, essentially arguing why he should consider expanding the scope of his injunction to apply to customers of the company, maybe other companies as well, and maybe even a national injunction against the ATF's new rule on frames and receivers. Now, the plaintiffs did file for a motion to expand the scope of the injunction, and they argued to the court that it should be expanded to protect the customers of tactical machining, that it should also be expanded to protect the members of one of the organizational plaintiffs' Firearms Policy Coalition, and they argued that the FPC members should be protected under the injunction, and also other manufacturer members of FPC, including 80% Arms and also Defense Distributed, should also be protected by the injunction. And finally, they argued that the injunction should be expanded to a national injunction against the ATF's enforcement of the final rule, because the judge here already found that this new rule on frames and receivers is facially invalid. In opposition, the ATF argues that a national injunction is not necessary to give relief to the plaintiffs in the lawsuit. The ATF argues that the limited injunction that has already been granted meets the needs of the parties in this case. In this section of their opposition, the ATF states, "No extension of the preliminary injunction to tactical machining's customers is necessary to afford complete relief to tactical machining." They argue that the plaintiffs have not plausibly alleged that the decrease of sales that they are putting forward is actually attributable to this new rule on frames and receivers, as opposed to just tactical machining not selling these jigs and these 80% kits combinations. They say that that is a voluntary thing that tactical machining has done on their own, so it's not the ATF's fault. The ATF states that plaintiffs attest that if it were not prohibited by the final rule, tactical machining would again manufacture and sell jigs, which from tactical machining's past experience would significantly increase sales of tactical machining's other products. But Tactical Machining has not offered jigs for sale alongside its unfinished frames and receivers since several months before the new rule took effect. And because of this, the ATF argues that there is no evidence that if Tactical Machining were to once again sell these products in combination with a jig and a frame receiver, that their sales would go up, or that maybe their profits would go up, or there would be any impact. They are saying that they voluntarily decided to do this, so that's kind of on them. But there's really two important things I want to point out here in the ATF statements. First, it's kind of comical that the ATF is saying that nothing is stopping Tactical Machining from selling 80% or parts kits alongside with jigs. The one thing that is stopping them, and that is always looming over them, is the ATF and their own rule on frames and receivers. The ATF is saying if they do sell these products in combination, frames and receivers alongside with jigs and instructions, they have to do it in compliance with the new rule. If they don't, there is the threat that the ATF will go after them. And because of this, a lot of manufacturers have decided to simply not sell this combination of frames and receivers alongside with jigs and instructions. Instead, they are deciding to simply sell just the unfinished frame or receiver. A lot of them are not even selling jigs at all anymore. And again, that is having a huge impact on a lot of these manufacturers, on a lot of these companies, and it's also impacting their sales. And for the ATF to argue that they can still sell all these items, all they have to do is comply with the new rule, is simply kind of just begging the question. Of course they can do that, but what is being challenged here in this case is the enforcement of that new rule. And a second really important thing that came out of this was the ATF's response about what actually qualifies as an 80% or parts kit that is regulated under this new rule on frames and receivers. Here they're saying that unfinished frames and receivers sold on their own does not meet the qualifications of this new rule on frames and receivers. But if they are sold in conjunction with jigs, then it would qualify. So again, this is something that they stated prior in the lawsuit. They've made statements to this effect before, but once again, we have them on the record saying that what this new rule really impacts is the sale of unfinished frames and receivers along with jigs. Then the ATF goes on to oppose the expansion to a national injunction. In the ATF's opposition to a national injunction, they argue that a national injunction would be more burdensome to the ATF than is needed in this case. In their opposition, the ATF argues that even though their new rule has national implications, that doesn't mean that an injunction at a national level is needed. The ATF argues that the injunction in its limited scope meets the needs of the plaintiffs here in this case. In contrast, the plaintiffs state that plaintiffs do not argue that broad injunctions are appropriate in all contexts, but based on the court's and appellate precedent related to facial APA challenges, and because the final rule itself is in excess of ATF's congressionally mandated authority, plaintiffs request that this court broadly enjoin enforcement of the final rule. Essentially, the argument by the plaintiffs for a national injunction is that since this judge already has found that the new rule is facially invalid and goes beyond the scope of congressionally delegated authority to the ATF, the court should nationally enjoin the enforcement of that rule. The court has already found that this is facially invalid, and therefore the logical step was to enjoin it, or should enjoin it, at a national level. So that's a quick rundown of the battle that is going on right now to expand the injunction against the ATF's new rule on frames and receivers. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and comment down below and I'll try to answer the best of my ability. Also, like this video and like support the channel. One of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm or fuel Al Gore's rhythm. It adds fuel to his jet and signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of two-way news. Also, I want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is USCCA. Recently, I actually had the opportunity to go out to their headquarters, go through all their training, go through all their education, including some range time, their defensive pistol courses that they're going to offer, and also the new rifle course that they're going to offer as well. It was top-notch, the training, the education, the range day, and also through your membership, you get all of that, including self-defense liability protection. So if you're interested, check them out. I will leave a link down in the details section. So again, thank you so much for all of your support. And as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And never forget, this nation is built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.